And we're live. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely evening. We brought back two fan favorites. We have today Ellie Cohen and Sarah Simon. They were on a few months ago and we got great feedback. One even went as far to say this was their favorite episode yet on the channel. So obviously we brought them back. Sarah, Ellie, great to have you here.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get started, a quick shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd, SOG Cannabis, Max Marine, Geffen Posner, Adam Becker, Maya, Kimberly, Jordan Walter, Nate Hinman, Julian Melser, and our one and only legendary member, Speedy Weedy. Speedy Weedy is a cannabis delivery company in Southern California. If you're into that, you can find a link to their description, to their website in the description. It's weird that these cannabis companies support the show. I'm not sure why, but they like what we do. So Ellie and Sarah are both awesome individuals whose ideas and input I truly value. If you want to find more information about them or find their contact information, you could find that in the description as well. For those who don't know, 2 weeks ago on this channel, I had a debate with Adam Green on the topic of anti-Semitism. Getting prepared for that debate allowed me to really learn the anti-Semitic claims in depth. And I understood that they're not all equal in terms of how reasonable they sound. So there's some that are just like way out there about like a small group of Jewish Kabbalists who control Israel, and through their control of Israel, they control the United States with the goal of enslaving the Gentiles and one day annihilating them. People genuinely believe that. We're not going to waste time addressing, just such ridiculous claims. We're going to focus on claims that are seemingly more reasonable. We don't believe in shying away from these ideas. We're going to address them head on. Hope you all enjoy. So the first claim that I want to talk about is about Jewish overrepresentation, right? So, and they have these like lists of all the Jews in positions of power, and they show that like in some industries, from media to certain finance, Hollywood, that Jews have a very high representation in those industries, up to 20% in some industries. So they asked themselves, so the argument goes as such. It said, Jews are way overrepresented in these positions of power. Why aren't we allowed to talk about it? Why is talking about it anti-Semitic? When people talk about white people being overrepresented, that's okay. But when it's Jews, suddenly we're silenced. So they see that as, why are you silencing us if there's no legitimacy to what we're saying? That's like one argument. How would you two engage with that?
Well, I'll start. Well, one thing is to understand why Jews ended up in certain industries that we ended up in. There are some reasons that there are some industries, that Jews are somewhat disproportionately more concentrated in, and there are some that Jews are largely under concentrated in. There's a great book. It's actually called The Jewish Phenomenon. I'll just throw that out there for anyone that wants to read it. And it talks about the history of Jews in America, and it really gets into a lot of why Jews went into certain industries over other industries, and a lot of it has to do with certain industries that Jews weren't allowed to enter into in the 1800s or early 1900s. And that could explain a lot of why Jews aren't even necessarily obviously we know we aren't overrepresented across the board. There are many industries that there aren't that many Jews in, that aren't that common for Jewish communities to lean towards. I don't know how it works in other communities, but my community, there are jobs are more encouraged or less encouraged, and there are some that are discouraged. And a lot of that has to do with the history of Jews in America and the jobs that we were able to do, and also the jobs that we created for ourselves. For example, lawyers and doctors. Jews weren't allowed to work in certain law firms. They weren't allowed to work in certain hospitals, so they made their own. That's how a lot of I believe it's Big Law, but don't quote me on that. I'll have to double check the book. The firms that were founded by Jews were founded because they weren't allowed to work in other law firms. Some of the hospitals that have Jewish or Hebrew sounding names were founded by Jews because they weren't allowed to be working in other hospitals. This was obviously a long time ago. Things have changed, but that's one of the reasons that we can get an understanding of why Jews are in some industries more than in others. Another thing is a lot of these like charts. I actually have a chart here. I could like hold it up to the screen. If anyone wants it, they could DM me for it. It shows, let's put it this way. It shows a breakdown of all the charts that they use. Like, you know, when they put out those like pieces of like propaganda that have the stars on them, that like, oh, this is a Jew, that's a Jew. And it breaks down every company. This one specifically is for, I believe, the media. Yeah, it's for all different media companies, news companies, cable companies, etc. Like HBO, MTV, like NBC, you name it, it's like on this chart, and it actually goes through whether or not they're Jewish and like kind of debunks like those like star charts of Jews that people put out there. So I can't like, it's on my phone. I don't think I could share it on the screen, but I can hold it up, and it just kind of goes through the whole chart and highlights everyone and kind of gives like a debunking to that chart. But I think one thing that's hard for like when people confront these kinds of like conspiracy sometimes, or sometimes just like distorted reality, it can be really hard to address it because a lot of people don't know who actually controls the companies. Like if I can't name offhand who controls all the media companies. So someone's confronted with this, we might know it has like anti-Semitic undertones or is anti-Semitic, but it can be hard to dispute when like we're not armed with all this information of who controls every media company. Like most normal people don't know offhand.
The thing that I'll add to what Ellie just said too is on top of the historicity specifically behind why there's overrepresentation of Jews in Hollywood and in banking. With banking especially, there's a long and anti-Semitic history there that starts very early in Europe. But aside from that, it's not really about if we're speaking accurately, which a lot of the times the overrepresentation is misconstrued or misrepresented or taken to conspiratorial levels. It's not really about talking about accurate levels of overrepresentation in these certain sectors. It's more about the ideas and the nonsensical beliefs that this statement forays into. It kind of lends itself to discussions that are entirely untrue and have caused harm to Jewish people for centuries, which are ideas about, you know, a Jewish cabal, Jewish control of the media, Jewish control of the government, and kind of like this overall world Jewish conspiracy to control things. And I think that's really where you get into hairy territories. The intention behind bringing these things up is very different, and the consequences of doing so because of the way that anti-Semitism scaffolds these beliefs can get really harmful really quickly.
Thanks to both of you. I'd like to add something on that I think might be like at the core of the issue of looking at overrepresentation, and a similar claim can also be made against those talking about overrepresentation of white people, for example. But it's for overrepresentation to be a problem, you need to do two things. You need to make the case that there's like some intention to being overrepresented, like there's some manipulation or nefarious intention to having that control. And two, you need to assume that there's something about the people in control that their identity somehow is impacting their decisions. So what does it matter if Jews are overrepresented? You don't know, you're not saying anything about those Jews and what they actually believe, right? Jews are by no means a monolith. So what does it matter? It's essentially judging everybody based off them being Jewish, not who they actually are as individuals. So it's really the entire premise of this is grouping us up and attributing certain traits to us, certain intentions to us, and that's really at the core of all forms of group hate, essentially.
What I will caveat your statement with, which I largely agree with, but I will just say I do think that there's a really critical difference between white people, especially in America, being overrepresented. Overrepresented in certain sectors versus Jewish people, because very explicitly, if we're looking at the historical record, which again I think is really integral to all conversations kind of surrounding this, the overrepresentation of white people is directly tied to certain power structures that have come at the exclusion of other groups in society, whereas with Jewish people, they're actually related to our own history of oppression, and are not built on the same power structures and don't have the same consequences vis-a-vis other groups in society, vis-a-vis society writ large, that overrepresentation of white people does. So that's the only thing that I would say to that. I do think that there's a really important difference there, but I largely agree with what you said.
We're gonna leave it at that because I don't want this to get into the topic of yeah.
That's okay.
I already see people commenting about wokeness and stuff like that. So no, look, I accept the difference. I know it's not a one-for-one parallel, but I think that there's similar flaws in both arguments, despite them being different, as you explained. Cool. So I think we've done work with this one claim, right? I don't see anybody in the comments pushing back, so it seems like everyone's convinced or remaining silent for now. Another claim, and this actually was a case that Adam made. I actually think it was one of the better points he made in our discussion. He says that the CEO of Viacom is a religious Jew. She's from Chabad. Now, he was also able to pull up all sorts of texts and teachings that are common amongst Chabad that talk about Jewish supremacy. So, and again, I'm gonna use the white parallel. And Sarah, this difference between white people and Jews, there's constantly going to be that difference, but I don't think that difference is enough to entirely dispel the case being made. So, I want us to be able to still be able to address it. If a white person were to be the CEO of some media company, and they were to be part of some like sect of Christianity that had very strong ties with like white supremacy, like or bigotry, like the Baptist Westboro Baptist Church. Yeah, right. So imagine if a CEO was from there, and then it would be legitimate to be like, wait, I don't know about that. I don't know if I trust this company because look at the CEO. Again, in order to do that, you do need to assume something about their intentions, but we would certainly let that slide. We would let somebody, say, we could question somebody's leadership if they're of a group that has certain supremacist ideas, but if that person's Jewish, then we're not allowed to talk about it.
Okay, so actually, this is one thing I wanted to specifically bring up that I didn't watch the whole discussion last time, but I did watch parts of it. And so first we have to backtrack a bit. First, what are Chabad's beliefs? For background, I grew up Orthodox. I'm not an expert in learning by any means, but I do have like my basic education. So first of all, a lot of these beliefs that I've heard brought up and these like Talmud quotes that people pull out, and I've seen the whole list that they have, some of them don't exist. Some of them are mistranslated. Some of them are taken out of context. Some of them, I don't know what this guy specifically brought up, but I think one thing to understand is that it's important to be able to first understand what they're talking about and understand, is this actually a belief that exists? Because there's a big difference between wondering, do these beliefs exist, and what are these texts trying to say or teach, and accusations that, oh, Jews believe in this without even trying to understand what these texts are saying. So first of all, what is the Talmud? I'm assuming this is what he was talking about, because that's what usually is brought up in like conversations with white supremacists. So the Talmud is a book that is a compilation of discussions between rabbis. So it's not necessarily Jewish law. Sometimes it's rabbis discussing a hypothetical scenario that may or may not have ever happened. And then there could be a plethora of different opinions. Not all opinions are equal, and not all opinions are held equally in Jewish thought. Some are considered, like certain sects sometimes follow different rabbis, certain rabbis are held to higher esteem. So the Talmud is a compilation of all these different conversations. Now, someone could have a great point, someone could have a point that they're disputing, and there are a lot of times that these conversations are taken out of context, mistranslated. I haven't studied the whole Gemara, so I can't sit here and like explain every single passage, but there are rabbis that can. And I think one of the things that's important is for someone that's even going into these discussions about these different quotes or these different lines should have a background of Gemara education, of knowledge on these different quotes, to be able to dispute and say, no, that's not actually what it says. This is what it's saying. This is the context. This is what it means. And one thing also is, in order to be able to understand what it's saying, you have to be able to understand the language, so either Aramaic or Hebrew. And I think if people are going into these discussions, they should be a rabbi that has this kind of background education. Like, I've even been confronted with these quotes sometimes, and I have no idea what they're talking about. I've never heard them in my life, and I'll take them to a rabbi or to a friend that like studies Gemara, and I'll say like, "Hey, can you check this quote for me? It says that it's this passage." Sometimes they come back and are like, "Hey, this doesn't exist. It's not in the Gemara I checked." Sometimes they're like, "Oh, this is what this person was talking about. It's discussing whatever it is." So I kind of just rambled for a bit. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Would you like to add to that, Sarah? Or?
So I can't speak specifically to the Chabad context, and I don't know exactly what he was saying, but I do want to talk a little bit about the term Jewish supremacy and kind of, I guess it's unwanted evolution in like discourse around Jews. So it's actually a phrase that started in a Der Stürmer publication and was popularized in America many years later on the alt-right sphere of things by David Duke, who wrote an essay with that in the title. And then it's also kind of been translated over to discussions about Israel and discussions about Zionism. But really, ultimately, what it is it speaks again to these conspiracy theories about Jews. And it's often interwoven with this idea about Jewish people being the quote unquote chosen people. Ellie, I know you made a really good post about that on your Instagram a while back. If you kind of want to elaborate about the misconceptions surrounding that term and what it actually means, I think that could be really good.
Well, sure. So I think one thing to understand first, like before I kind of explain what the meaning is in Judaism, is that each religion has some kind of belief, and this even applies to like others and other than the Abrahamic religions of like either this is the best way to like live life, or this is the practices that should be practiced, or like other indigenous people have like mythology that is specific to them and says like, oh, because we are these people, this is something that will only happen to us. So I think that's one like kind of precedent. Now, when it comes to the chosen people, I think one thing that's to start, it doesn't mean superiority. It means that we entered in a covenant with God. So not only did God choose us to follow extra laws, and I'll explain what that extra is in a minute, but we also accepted it. And actually in the Torah it says that God offered it to all the other nations and they declined. And then we accepted these 613 commandments. And in Judaism, we actually have a practice called the Noahide laws, which basically are 7 laws that non-Jews can follow if they choose. And it's kind of like the equivalent to Jews having to follow the 613 mitzvot. So yeah, I hope that kind of explain that. I have a more in-depth post on my Instagram that actually like has a clip of Rabbi Sachs talking about the meaning of the chosen people in Judaism. And this topic of the chosen people also is something that there are like hour-long shiurim or sermons, I guess is the English equivalent of that. Like hour-long sermons by different rabbis with like slightly varied interpretations and like how the meaning of that kind of applies to our life.
Yeah. I do want to, Sarah, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
No. Well, first, there's a comment I feel the need to address. So it goes, Lotus Flower goes, Adar, you sound anti-Semitic. Yeah, I'm presenting the anti-Semitic argument. I would hope that that's how it would sound. If not, I didn't do a good job making the argument. So thank you for acknowledging that I did a good job. I appreciate that. This one I want to address real quick about Pittsburgh Dude 87 goes, the fact that U.S. gives so much money to Israel and that the policy is bipartisan and the social safety net gets rolled back is a bad look. So what I would say to that, I mean, that's not unique to Israel, right? There's many countries, and you can look at the list, there's many countries that get U.S. aid, and it's bipartisan support. If you want to look at the reason for that, it likely has something to do with the defense industry and how much money they spend lobbying, because something like 85% or 75% of the money that Israel gets needs to be spent on U.S. weapons companies. So it's essentially a subsidy to American defense contractors, and they spend much more money lobbying than any Jewish group. So you want to understand why there's bipartisan support. The military-industrial complex is probably your answer. Regarding the topic of you feel free to build on that, or we could keep going on. We good?
What topic?
There's some things I could say about Abby Martin, but we might not want to get into that.
Do we see Abby Martin?
Specifically as a figure.
Well, I don't. Yeah,
I mean,
if you
she's
want,
like
if
a
you want.
crazed 9/11 truther conspiracy theorist and a sadist who's been propped up in these conspiratorial realms of the discourse as some sort of lionized figure. And honestly, it's a red flag whenever you see her name in any sort of legitimizing fashion, because if you look up any of her beliefs, they're super unhinged, might be the word, writ large.
Video, I think Adar, you did a video in here of like going through one of her videos with like.
Yeah, we did Abby Martin debunking. Yeah. I'd be happy to have her on the show to chat. You know, maybe we got to get a little bigger before she'll come on. But yeah, that'd be nice. So I want to go back to like the Jewish supremacy, and I'm gonna take a small risk here because I think there's potentially certain like issues or challenges in the Jewish community that are probably just better discussed amongst Jews, right? Not like open in the public amongst other people. And I think all communities have this. I think like, you know, I've had a Black rights activist on the show. When I asked him a question, he said, I'd rather not talk about that. That's an issue between the Black community. So I do acknowledge that there's some of these issues, and perhaps the concept of Jewish supremacy is one that Jews need to talk about from within. But, you know, Sarah, you do say that it was a term created by anti-Semites, which I've heard that as well, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And amongst secular Jews, there's very little supremacist ideas, but this isn't like a novel idea amongst certain sects of religious Jews. It's quite common. Like we could give a charitable interpretation of the chosen people, but I come across a fair amount of Jews, primarily Hasidic Jews. Can I say primarily Chabad? I'm not sure. They're the ones I speak to the most because they sometimes stop me on the street and stuff, and we have a little chat. But you know, they're not shy in talking about the Jews being elevated and special and unique and stuff like this. And again, I'm taking a risk by speaking about this publicly. Maybe I'll accept pushback on this. But I do think that it's not. We shouldn't just brush it under the rug and say claims of Jewish supremacy is just an anti-Semitic claim. No, I think it does exist, and I think Jews should be talking about it. And one more thing, maybe a counterclaim could be like, what's the point of focusing on it if it's harmless, right? I hear that as well. That's the point I made to Adam. Like, why do you even care if one person thinks they're better if they're not actually harming others? So I do hear that counterclaim, but I don't know if it's right to say that there's no such thing as supremacy amongst the Jewish people, because it exists. It's here, you know. The question is what we do with it.
I'm going to let Ellie deal with the actual beliefs of more religious Jews, but I will just really briefly kind of, I guess, to explicitly rebut that. What you are hearing from the people who are Jewish speaking to you and what you are interpreting as quote unquote Jewish supremacy is not at all what is meant by it when anti-Zionists speak about it, when white nationalists speak about it, when the Nazis spoke about it. These are, I guess, you could even divide that into three entirely different categories of what Jewish supremacy is being interpreted as. Zionism as Jewish supremacy is not the same thing as the Jewish supremacist conspiracy to take over the world and dominate it, et cetera, et cetera. And they might have some interlappings, but not anything that's sort of cogently related. And similarly, I think that, you know, Ellie, I'm going to hand it to you to talk specifically about these beliefs to the extent that you can, but the idea that like we are promoting Jewish supremacy within our own communities in any sort of tangible fashion, I think is a contestable statement at best. And I don't really think that exists at the level that is trying to be portrayed by anyone who uses this term.
Yeah, I could add in I'm definitely gonna have to push back on that. Sorry, Adar. So one thing I think to understand, I mean, I can't speak to every person that you meet on the street. Obviously, I don't know. I haven't been there with all your discussions, but I think one thing, like I said before, is to understand what do these things mean? Like when we learn about like when people talk about like the Jewish soul or like our neshama, like what does that mean in practice? What do these things mean in our daily life? What does it mean to Orthodoxy? What does it mean to Orthodox Jews? I think that's one of the first most important things to understand. And now it actually pushed back on you that it's something unique to Orthodoxy, because I'll give an example. Let's say a secular Jew tweets like all Jews are hot. Like that's something, or like any ethnic group tweets like, oh, my ethnic group, like I love fill in ethnic group. Does that mean that they're supremacists, or does that mean that they care about their people like most ethnic groups do? And I think, like, I'll give another example. I went to an all Jewish school. Does that mean that I hate non-Jews? Does it mean that my parents don't want me associating with non-Jews? No, they wanted me in a certain environment learning Jewish studies. And like some people can take that to mean, oh, her parents don't want her around non-Jews. And this, I'll kind of explain like what the example is after, but some people can take that to mean, oh, her parents don't want her to be hanging out around non-Jews. Her parents don't want her to look at non-Jews. Her parents don't want her to be within 5 feet of non-Jews. Or does that mean, oh no, my parents actually just wanted me to get a Jewish education and that's something only Jewish schools can provide? So all of these things can be taken for what they mean to Orthodox Jews, or they can be interpreted in whichever way they want by non-Jews. So I think to actually understand these beliefs is to understand, which I can't do. I can't go through every belief that we have in the Torah about like Jews, because I don't know everything. You need like a good rabbi in here for that. But I think that in order to understand these beliefs, you have to really understand like what these mean to our daily lives, how these interpretations are. And there are different rabbinical interpretations for different laws that we have, for different practices that we have, for different beliefs that we have. So yeah, I think that kind of is that. Hope that answered.
Okay.
Made sense.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few ways to look at this. I mean, Sarah, what you explained about the what we mean by Jewish supremacy is different, right? Like when Nazis said it, they meant something else. So when you use the term, you're essentially potentially perpetuating their idea of it. And I understand that. I think that like our usage of our word usage is important, and we should use language that not only helps explain things, but in a way that doesn't perpetuate certain notions or stereotypes about a group of people. So I definitely appreciate you putting that out there. And Ellie, as you said, a lot of it comes down to interpretation. I'm still not fully convinced that it's like, I don't want to say a non-issue, but when I hear people talking about like supremacist values among certain sects of Judaism, like I don't think it's convincing to say that like they're just misunderstanding it. Like
Well,
I
I'm
almost
not convincing because I can't explain it better, but a good rabbi can't. Like a good rabbi can actually explain these beliefs and what they mean in our lives.
Well, yeah, but it's not like I'm talking about like general. Like I'll just give you one anecdote, and in it, you can't build an entire case based on an anecdote. But on Twitter, I posted something about on the topic of chosen people and stuff like that, and a religious Jew commented, said, "What's wrong? We are better." And then I said,
pretty sure that was probably sarcastic.
I don't know. And then I said, thinking you're better makes you by default worse. He goes, no. End of conversation. Like, I'm not going to argue that, but like, and he has no problem saying it publicly on Twitter. That like hurts me to see, because like that obviously perpetuates certain ideas about us.
But
I don't know
again,
how much
the vast. Okay, so let's just say for argument's purposes, there's a small subset of Jews who genuinely believe that the Jewish people are better than all other people on earth. It's kind of, you're already putting yourself in a prejudicial mind space to assume that this reflects negatively writ large on the Jewish community, because it makes it seem like it's some sort of representative belief that we writ large have, when it's not at all. So that's part one of that. But part two of that, I think what you prefaced your statement with is the most poignant part of what you said, which is that you can't take one person's beliefs and make some sort of a case about them. I think we could all very comfortably sit here and say that the Jewish community does not believe that they're better than anyone else. And if you're defining supremacy based on that way, then we're actually less supremacist than a lot of other ideologies that scaffold civilization around the world, because we're not trying to spread our beliefs to anyone. We're not trying to impose these values on anyone. We're not trying to make claims about how we're better than everyone on any sort of a meaningful platform or basis. And so if these are fringe ideas within a community, which every idea has fringe actors, fringe beliefs, fringe people within it, then so be it. We can't control that, and we're not responsible for controlling that. And I think that that's kind of where it ends.
I'm with you. I think, as we'll see, most forms of group hate can come down to attributing certain characteristics to the whole when they exist in certain individuals. And if we could just learn to view the individual and judge them for who they are, then that kind of that kills all forms of group hate. So I think that's going to be a constant theme in many of the hateful arguments we hear. On my end, those were actually the two that I wanted to get your input on. I wanted to hear your thoughts on. I think you both did a great job kind of breaking that down from very different perspectives. To those offended by me playing devil's advocate, I hope you forgive me, but that's what we're here to do.
That could be an interesting episode. There are like lists of like these Talmud quotes that like make no sense, and like having a rabbi on it and going through them and like discussing what they mean.
Yeah, we could bring on Talmudists, Kabbalists. It could be interesting. I'm definitely down for that. So, what other you both said you had a few topics you'd like to bring up, talk about. I'd like to maybe dedicate 15 minutes to this next segment, and then we'll have 15 minutes left for audience questions, because I do see a lively chat. People are very much enjoying this. I think they'll want to ask you some questions.
Absolutely. I mean, really, we can take this in any direction that y'all want it. There's this could literally be just like an ongoing thing where we talk about different subsections of anti-Semitism and how they manifest, because it's such a broad topic, to say the least.
Well, there's actually one comment here that I would answer to. Someone said something about like our parents wanting us to only marry other Jews. First of all, it's not my parents, it's me, and I'll get into that for a second. I want to raise a Jewish household. I want to have Jewish like practices in my house. I want to send my kids to Jewish school. So obviously it makes sense for me to marry someone that also wants that. And who would that be? Another Jew. And before anyone tries to say, oh, well, it's like white people wanting to marry white people, which it's obviously not. Jews aren't a race. They come in all different colors, and it has nothing to do with anyone's color. I'd marry any Jewish person, but as long as this person has the same values, and I don't just mean like is a good person, because obviously values can be interpreted in different ways, but someone who wants to have the same kind of household. Think about it. If someone wants to spend the rest of their life traveling, and someone wants to settle down and have a steady job, they're not going to be compatible. So for me, somebody who doesn't want to send their kids to a Jewish school, someone who doesn't want to keep Shabbat, who doesn't want to have a kosher kitchen, won't be compatible with me, because we just will have different things that we want in our life. So it's not just that my parents want it for me, it's that I want it because I know what I want my future to look like. I'm old enough to decide if that's something I want or not. And yeah, I think that kind of addresses.
The other thing, I completely agree with what Elia said. The other thing that I want to add on here, though, that I think gets often lost in the tunnel vision of trying to address like certain accusations made against Jewish people, is the very, I guess maybe even the number one standard principle of bigotry, which is different standards applied to different people. You would never, ever even think about looking at a Muslim person and say that they're bigoted or supremacist for wanting to marry another Muslim person. You would never look at another Christian person and say the same. You would never look at another indigenous people who have it as part of their tradition to marry within their tribal community, within their nation, and say that's bigoted of you, that's exclusionary of you, et cetera, et cetera. And so to somehow manufacture this claim specifically for Jewish people, I think in and of itself, I take a lot of issue with it, because it's manufactured from this principle of different standards for a different group of people, i.e. it's bigoted.
That is one of the themes I noticed when like deep diving certain anti-Semitic claims is really the double standard. It's having a different like standard and set of expectations for Jews. It's very much present when you look at when you look at the narratives. Maybe to put it simply, any two adults have the right to get married as long as they're both consenting, and no one has any right to say anything about it. And if you try, you can go fuck yourself. Excuse my language, but there's no reason to even like debate that.
No,
Adults
it's
can
so
marry
true.
each other. Get over it, you know? Yeah. Questions, or you want to? Well, let's start collecting the questions. Chat, ask some questions. Obviously, we'll prioritize super chats. Thanks in advance. Also, 50% of super chats will go to Ellie and Sarah. So we all, Daniel, you're coming with the hard hitting ones. Daniel's like, what about incest? I'm not going to open that now, but hit me up on Discord. We actually spoke about it once there, so you can hit me up. We'll talk about it. And I saw, hold on. I saw one other. I can't find it. Is there another topic you want to present while we get the questions in?
So we may want to dedicate another episode to this. I don't know. But Ellie and I were having a discussion with one of our good friends the other day, and she presented, something that I thought was really profound and really poignant and true. And I'd never heard it framed in this way. But she presented anti-Zionism versus Zionism for Jewish people as the modern day convert or die. And Ellie has written a really important Twitter thread kind of outlining the thinking that goes into what is being asked of Jews from the non-Jewish world, specifically people who align themselves with anti-Zionist movements in terms of what it takes to accept a Jew in modern times. Ellie, I thought you phrased the thread really well. If you kind of want to go over it or even pull it up and read it.
So the thread was essentially addressing the kind of victim blaming that we saw during May. That's when I wrote it, when people were saying, well, it's actually the Jews' fault that they're getting attacked on the streets and that like hate crimes are spiking because they connect Zionism and Judaism. So I wrote this thread. There's a malicious effort to force Jewish people to either abandon their connection to Israel, otherwise be blamed for anti-Semitic attacks that happen in the diaspora because they connected the Jewish faith in Israel. And I wrote that in like these letters. Anyways, okay. Notice how the rhetoric is always they conflated Judaism and Zionism, not they conflated the worldwide population with the actions of a government whose policies I may or may not even have accurate information about. Zionism is an intrinsic part of Judaism. Judaism as a religion or cultural practice was created to maintain our connection to the land of Israel and preserve our land-based practices. The rhetoric that we hear is not telling us there's a problem with attacking random Jews for government policy or action that I disagree with. It's saying that the Jewish people have to figure out how to abandon their connection to the land, aka abandon parts of Judaism. Otherwise, we'll keep attacking them wherever we'll find them and it will be justified. So our friend had this good kind of take on it, and she said essentially it's the new convert or die. Basically, you have to figure out how to completely disconnect yourselves from these practices, from this land, from anything that ties you to it, from 500,000 Jews by extension. 6 million Jews. Not half a million Jews, half the Jews in the world that live in Israel by extension. Otherwise, face whatever consequences, so to speak, we decide are applicable to you in the diaspora.
And this manifests in a lot of different ways, but some of the understated ways, I think, number one, you see all of these self-proclaimed anti-Zionist Jewish groups like JVP, like INN, literally having to go and change the prayers, change the meaning of holidays, change our prayer books, create new Passover Seder books, create teacup mikvahs, whatever it may be, because you literally cannot engage with Judaism without connecting it to the land of Israel, because we are a land-based group of people who have continued on these practices in spite of forced exile. And, ultimately it gets to a point where the question is, are these groups even practicing Judaism when they can't engage with Jewish prayer or Jewish texts in the way that they have been for millennia? Or are they kind of starting to practice a different sort of theology or a replacement theology of sorts? I don't know the answer or where we draw the line in the sand, but ultimately, if you have to change Judaism, it's no longer Judaism to the extent that they are. The second thing that I want to point out, just kind of as an axiom of history and something that I think we should be very aware of when we look at how people are engaging with anti-Zionism is the promise of anti-Semitic movements throughout history, regardless of how they manifest, regardless of how they unfold, has been the salvation of a society at the expense of the Jew. And so when we look at people who are trying to reverse Jewish sovereignty, who are trying to undo the Jewish collective, the same principles apply there. And we need to think about why we can't have a future that includes Jewish rights and Jewish sovereignty on our own terms, in terms that aren't mutually exclusive. And the only reason for that is because of this long legacy of what it means to be part of a movement that adheres to certain anti-Semitic beliefs and ideologies. So I guess the two takeaways from what we just explained is like having to give up Judaism, it's the modern day convert or die, and also why does salvation of society need to be at the expense of the Jew once again?
Yeah, and I want to add on one thing to what Sarah said about like the JVP, like obviously rewriting all the practices. I actually did a post on them, and I went through like pages and pages of material. They like I was mind blown. They have one for like every holiday, and for holidays that you didn't even think they would like need to rewrite it, they managed to, and like make up new, like literally make up new practices. So I think like also Sarah said you can't. What was they said? You can't practice Judaism without the.
I mean, when you change it beyond a certain point,
yeah.
Judaism
That's what I want to say. So the way the kind of like reference or example I like to give is that let's say I choose to eat bacon, right? I'm a Jewish person, I choose to eat bacon. That's my choice, and no one can stop me. No one can say you can't eat it. Like I'm old enough to make my own decisions. If I want to eat bacon, I can eat bacon. Doesn't make eating bacon a part of Judaism just because I'm a Jew that does it. Obviously, it's still against it, but I can do it anyways because obviously we live in a free country and we have freedom of religion, and we can decide for ourselves if it's something we want to do or not. So it's kind of like and there are things we can omit. Let's say I don't want to daven like or pray. I'm a Jew that doesn't pray because I actually do pray, but like I'm just using it as an example. Let's say then I'm a Jew that doesn't pray, and that's my choice because I can choose if I want to or not. That doesn't make praying not a part of Judaism. It is, I just choose not to do it because that's not how I feel like connecting to God. But it doesn't make it not a part of Judaism.
Yeah, that's it's actually an interesting concept that I've never heard before. So I appreciate you both breaking that down. I see a few questions here that I want to get to. Leica asked, "What's Ellie's Twitter handle?" You can find
use Twitter anymore, but I use Instagram, so it's probably better.
How much better is your mental well-being since stopping Twitter?
It's been amazing.
What a toxic cesspool that place is.
It's so bad. And you know what's something that's interesting that I was actually thinking about talking. See, Sarah and I were going to talk about today, but there's a lot of things we prepared just in case. So one thing was like illusory truth and how like propaganda works. Now, illusory truth is essentially like the psychology of like if you hear something over and over again, whether or not it's true, it can just kind of become a belief because it's just constantly repeated. This kind of like is like a propaganda technique. And like a lot of us like to think that like because the internet is like, oh my gosh, like we have everything at like the touch of our fingers, like we can find out anything we want, like we can learn about anything, like we're so enlightened and like we really do hear everything. But at the same time, it's just as easy to get stuck in like an echo chamber corner of Twitter and like become so radicalized and like really limit your feed to people that like agree with you or even more radical, and like ultimately kind of do the exact opposite of like become more enlightened and like learn about different things. It can just end up being like this very curated feed of people that agree and like ends up really stuck in an echo chamber. And that was just one thing I saw on Twitter that like I didn't like. I saw people like just stuck in their echo chambers and like becoming more radicalized. That was just one example, but there's a lot of things I don't like about Twitter, and I highly recommend everyone leave.
I've stopped scrolling Twitter. I check notifications, but I no longer scroll because I notice when I scroll, my mood is worse than when like before I started scrolling. Why do I need that in my life, you know? So you could, anyone watching can find Sarah and Ellie's contact information, their Instagram in the description of this video. This one I kind of want to address. This is a side note. Amihud says, "Go F yourself," real class, about me using the saying "go fuck yourself." So I want to share with you like an internal conflict I have. You know, I've been doing these live streams for, I think, going on 2 years now, and I have an internal dilemma of who I want to be when I'm hosting these conversations. How much of my true self do I want to hide? How proper and classy I want to present myself? And as time goes on, I think I'm just feeling more and more comfortable just being myself, and the same person I am off stream is the same person I am on stream. And maybe, some of my snark, some of my harshness, perhaps once in a while I'll curse. Maybe that's not for everyone, and I accept that. You don't have to watch, or you could watch and put up with it. But this is who I am, and this journey I'm on, this journey we're on with making content and connecting people. I feel much better doing it when I know I can be myself. So I hope you understand that. Cool. Let's do you see anything in chat you want to address?
I've not been looking, but
I could just answer what kind of echo chambers you find yourselves in Twitter. So I actually made a point to not like let myself get stuck in echo chamber and like follow people that like I don't agree with, and like make sure like I'm regularly checking accounts that will have like different perspective or opinion. So I don't think that I ended up in too much of an echo chamber. But I saw how like people quickly were like radicalized around me on Twitter, if that makes sense. And like maybe not actually in their life, they're not actually like radicalizing like this. And like I don't mean radicalizing in like a certain direction, but just becoming like super extreme in whatever it is, not even necessarily related to like Israel Palestine. But just ending up in like echo chambers, and like I didn't want to be in that kind of environment. I didn't feel like it was like a healthy environment to like put myself in for like a significant amount of time each day, like staring at this screen of people that are just kind of like stuck in echo chambers. And I guess like also it is the kind of feed that like you curate yourself. Maybe some people will have better experiences with it, but I didn't think it was like a good platform that's like conducive to much.
I'll speak on that like just super briefly as well. You follow who you want to, but at least the way that I've tried to do it, I follow people who put out information, who put out academic articles, who write about current events, who give different perspectives on history, on I guess current dialogue, the state of it all maybe. But I don't follow people who I don't feel like contribute in some like way to bettering my understanding of the world around me from different perspectives. And I think it kind of speaks to something deeper, specifically as it relates to discussions about Jewish related issues, about Israel and Palestine. A lot of the discourse really is low level. And I don't mean that in any sort of insulting way. I just mean that a lot of people are not actually very educated. They've not read books about it. They have not listened to different thinkers in different perspectives on the issue, and therefore don't really even know what they're saying a lot of the time, and it generates a lot of white noise that I think if we can collectively kind of push ourselves through and only try and platform people with understandings of kind of what's going on, what's been going on, I think that's the road to a better future, is not letting people with ignorant beliefs, not letting people who haven't really taken the time to understand what's going on, govern conversations. And I see that far too often as people who really just don't have an understanding of anything, being the ones who are allowed to lead these discussions and drive them forth or derail them. And there's this really profound quote, I think it's by Yossi Klein Halevi, that I repeat to myself all the time. And he says, accommodating both our narratives, learning to live with two contradictory stories is the only way to deny the past a veto over the future. And I think that that's really true, but that comes with the caveat of actually understanding these two different narratives, of understanding these two different stories, and how to engage with them in productive ways.
Yeah.
Anyway, Twitter's not the place.
One thing on Twitter also that I hate is that a lot of times, really, people that I would really think are intelligent would treat all opinions as if they're created equally. So, like, they'll treat academics and like forethinkers and like leaders, or like, and I don't mean leaders like the president. I mean like leaders of a community that are like self-appointed or whatever. The same like credibility as an anonymous Twitter account with 500 followers. That's one thing I really didn't like about Twitter. Just in general, I think that kind of like actually does carry over to people's like real life of like treating opinions as if every opinion is equal, which they're not. And like it's not even like, it's interesting because like if we like think about even like school, like in college, like if we're writing like a paper, like we're gonna cite sources, and not all sources are created equally. So why do we treat everyone's opinions like they have an equal amount of credibility?
I see Daniel Guerin had a funny comment about Twitter. If the list of things not to like about Twitter were written down, there would not be enough paper on earth to contain it.
That's very
Thanks, Daniel.
That's very true. That's very true.
And then Daniel has a question. Where do you see the fight against anti-Semitism from here? What do you think the future of it will look like? As a college student, I can't help but think that college campuses will be the main battleground, but that might be a bit self-centered of me.
No, I think you're exactly right with that, honestly. I think we may have even spoken about this a bit the last time that we were having a discussion of this nature, but there are many, and I'll just say it flat out and straight up because I do think it's pertinent to Jewish survival, and there's not really time to dance around the main point. There are a lot of very predatory organizations that will prey upon impressionable people who genuinely value progress and genuinely value bettering the world and bettering human rights, and sell them false notions of what that means and how to forward it. And they take people who are at the beginning of their intellectual career, who 10, 20 years down the line will become leaders in different institutions around the country and around the world, and implant these ideas into their head that, once again, salvation of society must come at the expense of the Jew. And these are ideas that have a lot of social rewards surrounding them, specifically for Jewish people themselves who allow themselves to be tokenized. These are ideas that really we have seen even in the last 3 to 5 years have changed the landscape of the way that people talk about anti-Semitism, about Israel and Palestine. And the reason that I'm focusing on that specifically is because, like Ellie and I were saying before, it really is, in my opinion, the modern day convert or die is where a lot of, I guess, anti-Semitic ideas are starting to reform and take shape, and kind of rebirth themselves in this new package. So I think that the fight from here, there's a lot of work to be done within the Jewish community, in my opinion, educating ourselves about our history, educating ourselves about, where we come from, who we are as a people, et cetera, so that we have a very strong foundation before we encounter anti-Semitism in more broad spheres, before we encounter these ideas about Jewish people and about Israel that may or may not be true, probably are not. And I think, too, the ability to effectively communicate our story and effectively communicate, what our values are and whatnot is something really important that I think there's room to work on. Ellie, I'll let you pick it up from here if you have any other ideas. I'll stop rambling.
But
yeah.
Of fighting anti-Semitism. I don't know exactly where it's going, but I do think that college campuses are a pretty important place because a lot of people kind of develop a lot of their thinking on college campuses. A lot of people do look up to figures on college campuses, do look for social acceptance on college campuses and get involved in clubs or groups or whatever that might mean. And I think that one second, I think that there are, once you start like really kind of like, I'm not saying this is for everyone that they should do it, but like putting yourself kind of in anti-Semitic spaces or like confronting material like that, you kind of start to hear a lot of the rhetoric and the misinformation. And there are a lot of certain things that are like regularly repeated and like pushed more than others. So I think kind of like just learning what those are and how to combat them can be really useful and really helpful for combating it on college campuses and just in general.
I'll add to that. I don't know if I could say what I think the future will be. I could say what I hope it will be, and I'd like it to move more into the direction of educational and not just reactive. So a lot of like the biggest well-known fighters of anti-Semitism, their role in fighting it is to wait for somebody to do something anti-Semitic, share it on their profile, generate outrage, generate likes, comments, retweets. But what actually happened? Whose mind was actually changed? Besides creating more outrage in the Jewish community, more fear in the Jewish community, was anybody actually educated, right? And this takes up the vast majority of the activists who are speaking against anti-Semitism. The reason why I've had Sarah and Ellie, you both on for the second time, and would love to keep having you on, is because you're both educators. You're not the ones that are just waiting for someone to say something and then calling them out as if that's going to change something. You actually are dedicated to teaching people in a patient and compassionate way. And I think this is, I hope the future of anti-Semitism are you two. So. No, sorry. The future, the future of fighting anti-Semitism are you two. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I really appreciate that. Can I briefly say something to that point?
Sure.
I think a really integral piece of actually combating these ideas and these narratives speaks exactly to what you were saying. Oftentimes, and I'm not blaming anyone by any means, but I see people behaving like we are backed into a corner in some way and getting super defensive or super reactive, when in my mind, I think it could be a more effective approach to behave like we're people who are deserving of liberation, who are deserving of being free of these ideas, and therefore being willing to kind of get ahead of these narratives, to go on the quote unquote offensive, so to speak. And make people kind of answer for what they themselves are positing ultimately. And this is something that I've said before, maybe even on here, when people are making accusations, they have the burden of proof for those. So if someone says, like, for instance, Israel is a settler colonial state, ask them to define what that means, and ask them how the idea of Jews being settler colonialists in their mind squares with the fact that Jews are an indigenous people. They have the burden of proof for their claim, whatever their claim may be. If it's a claim about like Jewish conspiracy to control the world coming from the alt-right or whatever, they have to answer for that. And we don't automatically need to go into defensive mode over explaining everything. We can just sit back and be like, okay, like, prove your point then. And like, if they can't, then we go into explaining. Or if they try to and go off on some crazy unwinding tangent, you can calmly explain the reasons that they're wrong. So just don't always go on the defensive is my best advice. Let people kind of dig their own holes and then help them get out of them.
Yeah, and I could also add on to that what you said about like the Jewish activism and the future of it. I think I definitely get what you're saying about like some people just kind of like generating outrage. I think that like the way I try to look at it doesn't always work out so well, is that like kind of everyone has a different purpose, maybe target audience with their platform. I think one thing to really think about is like, who's your target audience? Who are you trying to reach? Are you trying to change people's minds? Are you trying to like, what is the goal of what you put out online? What is the goal of what you're saying? What is the goal of like the work that you're doing? As well as, yeah, I really do wish that there were some more like education focus in certain areas. I can't say that like bringing attention to things is always bad. There are sometimes like things that people need to be mobilized for or whatever. But this constant like seeing something bad happen, reacting to it, and then especially people that will like pay a ton of attention to like accounts with like there's something on Twitter like I would I thought were smart, and we just spent all day arguing with people with like 10 followers whose names have like a bathroom word in it, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like you're older than me, like what are you doing on this app? And just in general, like I definitely think it's important for people that like put themselves in positions of like wanting to have a platform to like talk about these things to firstly like educate ourselves and then be able to pass that information over, because I really do think like education is the best way to combat misinformation.
100%.
Well put. So to wrap it up on a separate note, because I do want to be fair to Twitter as well, we have somebody supporting Twitter. We Need Critical Thinking goes, Twitter can be great. I've used it for product warranty help, communications with scientists, artists, and academics, breaking news and correspondence, and making new friends. So thank you. That's true. There is this whole positive side. I guess it depends how you use it, who you're following. But yeah, there are benefits. And thanks for sharing that. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts? Maybe you want to shout something out, something you're working on, where people could find you, although that is in the description.
I guess the only thing that I'll say is thank you for having us. Had a good time. And if you have any further questions for me, I think my Instagram is in the handle. I'm happy to send any articles or resources to anyone or answer any questions. I don't do as much like outward facing advocacy as Ellie does, but that means I have more time for the backdoor stuff. So you can treat me like your encyclopedia if you want to. I'm happy to provide sources about anything, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, thanks to anyone who tuned in, and I had a great time.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, my Instagram is Judean Ellie, and I'm pretty reachable there.
Awesome. I very much appreciate both of you. I like this little thing we got going on. We'll do it again soon enough. So for those watching, if you enjoyed this, expect to see Sarah and Ellie back on at some point. And with that, signing off, friends. Until next time.
Thank you so much, Adar.